Imagine transforming your health with just a few key changes. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Casey Means, a brilliant Stanford-trained physician who says,
because metabolic health is the foundation of all health, what you can expect to feel if you really get on top of it is improved mood, mental clarity, so much more energy, better sleep, healthy weight. It's incredible what happens when you really fix this most foundational part of our biology.
We are going to explore so many great science-based strategies to dial in your health and feel better than ever. I'm Chris Hutchins, and if you enjoy this video, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, or if you want to keep upgrading your life, money, and travel, consider subscribing. Casey, you say that the more we invest in healthcare, the sicker we get. How is that possible?
Oh my goodness, Chris. Well, first of all, for people who might not believe that, I think it's important to paint the scene of how sick Americans are. So right now, we've got 50% of American adults with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, full half the country. It's actually now 54%, 30% of teens with prediabetes. We've got 1 in 36 kids nationally with autism. 1 in 2 Americans in their lifetime are expected to get cancer. We're going to have the highest number of cancer cases ever in history this year, over 2 million new cases. Young adult cancers are up 79%. Infertility is going up 1% a year. Sperm count's down 50% since the 1970s. 77% of young Americans aren't fit to serve in the military. Autoimmune diseases are up about at least 5% per year. So our health is not good. On top of all this, mental health is in shambles. We've got close to 40% of 18-year-olds with a behavioral emotional or mental disorder, and 25% of women of my age group are on antidepressants. We are spending actually 2x more than any other country in the entire world on healthcare, and we have dismal health outcomes. We have the worst infant and maternal mortality of any developed country. So this is wild because $4.3 trillion are spent on healthcare each year. That's 23% or so of the largest GDP in the country. And meanwhile, it's a train wreck. And life expectancy has been going down for the past 3 years. So what's going on? I think the simple answer to that question is that we have an incentives problem in our country. It's actually that simple, which is that healthcare, which is the largest and fastest growing industry in the United States, has one way of economic growth, which is having more patients in the healthcare system, having more things done to them for a longer period of time. So it's still fundamentally largely a fee-for-service model where doctors get paid to see patients, so volume, and do things to patients, interventions. Because of that, there is very little economic incentives to actually get patients out of the system to prevent or reverse disease. Now, every single doctor I know, and I know probably at this point thousands, I've been to medical school residency, I've worked in hospitals, all of this, great people, went into medicine to help people, absolutely the best and noble intentions, and working their butts off. Unfortunately, these are amazing people going into a broken system with broken incentives, where, simply put, every institution in America that touches our health makes more money when patients are sick and less money when patients are healthy. And what you get when you have a fundamental incentive problem like that is you get the outcome that's expected, which is we have more sick patients in America than by percentage than almost any other country in the world.
You focused a lot on metabolic health and talked about how it's kind of at the core of a lot of things. Was that a place that someone wanting to take this into their own hands should be thinking about starting, and why?
Yes. So you could listen to the list that I said of all those diseases that are going up all at once, which is a fraction of the total diseases that are skyrocketing right now. And we could talk about Alzheimer's, we could talk about stroke, we could talk about chronic liver disease, on and on and on. But the secret, which is why I wrote Good Energy, which is why I left my surgical career to co-found Levels and totally shift the course of my life, is because the secret is that almost every chronic condition that's exploding in the United States and the Western world right now are fundamentally actually rooted in the exact same thing, which is called metabolic dysfunction. Recent research from the American College of Cardiology suggests that 93% of American adults have some element of metabolic dysfunction. Where this fundamental root of health crops up in the body will look like different symptoms. Like in the brain, that could look like depression or chronic pain or Alzheimer's dementia or ADHD. In the ovary, it could look like polycystic ovarian syndrome. In the blood vessels, it could look like retinopathy or heart disease or erectile dysfunction, all blood vessel issues. In the liver, it could look like fatty liver disease. So it's a foundational problem that's being ignored by the healthcare system, because then you get people into lots of offices getting lots of treatment, lots of drugs, and that gets us to ignore what the science is telling us is the root cause of why we're getting sick, which is metabolic dysfunction. So what is metabolic dysfunction? Very simply put, metabolism is the way that we convert food energy, so the food we take in, which is fundamentally chemical potential energy. It's how we convert potential energy into actual energy that our cells can use to power all the things that we have to do every day. So we have about 40 trillion cells in our body, and every single cell is doing trillions of chemical reactions every second. Almost all of those chemical reactions require energy for it to work. It needs like a coin to pay for that, that particular reaction. Our lives is the bubbling up of all of those chemical reactions. Right now, and we do that through in the mitochondria by and large, which everyone remembers from high school biology, it's the powerhouse of the cell, by breakdown products of our food, potential energy, going into the mitochondria, creating an energy that we can use to pay for all these chemical reactions. So that is the foundational layer of the pyramid of all health, because we can talk about brain health and hormone health and sexual health, all these things. But fundamentally, under all those layers, we actually just need gas in the car to do anything, to make a hormone, to have it, to even be able to have a functioning neuron. So it's foundational. The issue is that in the past 100 or so years, our world has changed so rapidly. The pace of change has been monumental. Urbanization, industrialization. And in this exponential pace of change over the past 100 years, primarily in the Western world, essentially the cells of the body are living in an environment that they no longer can really fully recognize and that is no longer conducive with cellular health. So our cells are constantly, taking in information from the environment, light energy, food energy, we're moving, we're sleeping, all these different things. And for our body, for us to have health, essentially the cells need to get what they need from the environment. But the environment has changed radically. And what's unique about how the environment's changed is that many of the factors of our environment now in modernity are synergistically hurting the mitochondria, this precious part of the cell that converts potential energy to real energy, just like destroying this part of the cell that does the foundational layer of health. So unless we are being like hyper vigilant to protect ourselves from the normalcy of our new modern environment, our mitochondria are getting damaged. And that's why we're seeing 93% of people with metabolic dysfunction. Just to give a brief overview of like what I mean by environmental factors and how they've changed, we're looking at things like how the norms of food, of sleep hygiene, of emotional health, of our movement patterns, of our relationship with toxins, our relationship with light, the medications we take, all these are kind of some of the buckets that we talk about. But with food, we used to eat food that was grown near our homes, like think 200 years ago. Food either grown in our garden, we'd eat it pretty fresh from the soil, we'd get those nutrients, they wouldn't have had chemicals on them. Now, 70% of calories that Americans are eating are ultra-processed, industrial manufactured Franken foods, grown in depleted soil that's covered with synthetic pesticides and fertilizers and travels an average of 1,500 miles from a factory to our plate. So 70% of our calories are just like this brand new invention made by scientists that does not meet the need of our cells and that actually hurts our cellular biology. So that's one example of what has changed. And if you go through each of those vectors, sleep, emotional health, stress, toxins, our relationship with light, our relationship with temperature, the medications we're taking, the world is not what it once was for our bodies. And our chronic disease epidemic is a representation of the body no longer being able to handle the environment. And the secret of the science is that the reason it's not working is because all these factors are synergistically destroying the part of the cell that makes energy. So this is fundamentally actually like an underpowering crisis. When we talk about metabolic dysfunction, it's our bodies not having what they need to do their work. And that looks like all sorts of diseases.
Is this kind of an isolated, unique situation in this country, or are a lot of this new environment we live in true all over the world?
Well, we're starting to see it really catch up in lots of other countries as we export the American way of life all over the place. But many of the statistics I mentioned are uniquely American. Like if you go to Japan, the childhood obesity rate is like 5%. Here it's like 5x that. So Japan's a high income country, but they have a completely different food system. They have a completely different relationship with nature and respect for nature. They have it's a very different culture. So when America exports their food to other countries and the way that we live, the countries seem to be getting sicker. But we are uniquely one of the sickest countries in the world because I feel like we are the epicenter of quote unquote technological progress. And we're moving away from nature at one of the fastest paces, I think, of any country. And so because of that, we're sort of the leading edge of sickness, but we do see it happening all over the world. What's interesting though, is that a lot of other countries have much stricter regulations about like what can go in the food and what can be marketed to people. Like it's unique that in America, 60% of mainstream media funding comes from pharmaceutical companies. So of course, we're seeing tons of ads that sort of create this insidious culture in our country that like medication's the answer for all health problems. And medications can be very valuable, but what that does is it kind of like subverts our attention away from more like natural mechanisms of healing towards pharmaceuticals. That's not legal in most other countries in the world. We have federal agencies in the US, like the FDA, where 75% of their budget is coming from the pharmaceutical industry. So we have some unique factors in the US around the way we allow, food to be created, the way we allow different industries around our health to advertise directly to people that other countries don't have, which changes the landscape. Not to mention, there's dozens and dozens of chemicals allowed on our food and in our food in the US that are just straight up banned in the EU. So it's both uniquely an American problem, but America has incredible power to influence culture all over the world. And so we're seeing it crop up all over the place.
You talked about food as one of the major pillars. When you think about what's going on in the body when you consume food, are there components of what's happening that are helpful for people to understand as we talk a little bit about how we might make changes?
Definitely. I mean, I think food is just this miraculous substance on so many levels that we need to have a totally different relationship with, because if we understood what food like really is, I think we would have so much more respect for choosing the highest quality food that we can. So I think of food as it's two things, basically. It's both the building blocks of our cells and the actual atomic molecular information that's going to make up our cells, but it's also the instruction manual for our cells. So it's like the molecular information that's going to change our genomics, change our gene expression, change our epigenetics, change our cell signaling. So it's as if it's like, both the architect, but also the bricks that are being used to build. It's fascinating. It's got these multiple roles. I love this like Taoist sort of idea that, the body and life it's a process, not an entity. So we think of the body as like, I'm Casey and you're Chris and I'm a thing and you're a thing and I'm going to live and then I'm going to die. But all of that is like, couldn't be farther from the truth on a molecular level. Like we actually have hundreds of billions of cells every single day that just flat out die and are reborn. So we're dying and are being reborn constantly throughout our lifetime. And the way that we rebuild and make new cells is we take in atoms and molecules from the food we eat and we 3D print new cells, out of that food. And so we want to be constantly giving the body really high quality material to be able to kind of grab the molecules that it needs to continue this lifelong process of 3D printing high quality structures. You wouldn't want to build your house out of crappy material. You don't want to build your body out of, suboptimal materials. Ultra processed food is nutrient depleted. It doesn't have the nutrients we need to build. And then you think about the more architect layer. So actually the instruction manual for our cells. So every day we're taking in tens of thousands of compounds from food, some of which we can't even name yet at this point, but like polyphenols and flavonoids and, it's just all these incredible compounds that actually interact with our DNA and interact with proteins in our cells to change what happens. So we can use food both to direct our genetic outcomes and our, cellular processes truly by using food and choosing food thoughtfully to get the outcomes we want. And then also, of course, to give the good building blocks. So to just give a very specific example of this, turmeric falls under the heading of nutrigenomics, which is this field of study that's amazing, which is how food compounds actually change gene expression. So turmeric has a compound in it called curcumin. Curcumin is a chemical that can go into our cells and bind to proteins in our cells that change the gene expression of a pathway called NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is a gene that is our master inflammatory gene. So once NF-kappa B is upregulated, it's going to promote an inflammatory response. It's going to get the immune system revved up. And we don't want that. We want that happening if we have an acute issue that needs to be fixed in the body, but we don't want that all the time because then you have your army in the body kind of constantly being revved up. So curcumin actually inhibits the expression of NF-kappa B. So I take a lot of curcumin every day, especially after like heavy workouts, because I want to, in our very inflammatory world that we live in, I want to give my body a signal to my genes to decrease inflammation. A similar thing happens when you take in cruciferous vegetables. So like cabbage and bok choy and broccoli and cauliflower. When you chop up cruciferous vegetables and you actually leave it out on a cutting board exposed to air for 30 minutes to an hour, a chemical reaction takes place in that crushed tissue of the plant that actually activates a set of molecules in the plant called isothiocyanates. One of them is called sulforaphane. That, again, goes into the cell once you eat it and upregulates a gene for antioxidants. And so antioxidants are these protective molecules that we can produce from our genome. We can literally manufacture, like we can manufacture more of them by the foods we eat. And those are going to create antioxidant proteins that can bind to reactive molecules in our cells that cause damage. We have some people have heard of the term oxidative stress or pro-oxidant. We live in a very pro-oxidant world with all the pollution and, just a lot of triggers to reactivity in our body. And we literally have a way through food to upregulate a molecule that can bind it and quell it. So that's two examples of thousands of how, with a little basic knowledge about understanding what food can do for you, you can choose what's on your plate to just be a reflection of the life you want to have and the person you want to be. It's not how we're really taught about food as we grow up. There's almost nothing that could be more important than to teach kids what the powers of each type of food they're eating and what molecules they contain so that they can use that as a form of agency to self-direct their life.
I love this. Is there a high level version of some rules people could start to think about for making food decisions aside from maybe just like nixing ultra processed? Are there other things that we should be considering?
Yeah. So, at the highest level, you just mentioned it, the best thing we can possibly do to have the mental and physical outcomes we want is eliminate ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods is a science experiment invented in the last 50 years. That's a weapon of mass destruction against human health, and it should be written to the annals of history. It's overwhelmingly associated with bad health outcomes. And I think people can understand why when you think about something that's just, been made in a factory filled with additives, colorings, preservatives, emulsifiers, devoid of nutrients. It's not going to be the thing you want to build your temple and to direct your cellular biology. So ultra processed foods, that's number one.
I imagine there are some things that everyone's like, I'm pretty sure a Twinkie is ultra processed.
Yes.
Are there things kind of more in the I'm not sure land and ways to kind of make a call? Is it looking for specific types of ingredients, or how do you actually know if something that isn't as obvious as a Twinkie is a processed food?
Yeah, there is a classification system called the NOVA classification system, which is unprocessed, minimally processed, basically processed culinary ingredients, which is like herbs and oils and salt and things like that. Processed and then ultra processed. So there's a spectrum. And I would say even within the processed category, there's many healthy foods. Like one of my favorite foods, which is flax crackers, which are like organic flax seeds that have been cooked with apple cider vinegar and water and salt and some herbs, and it makes this organic flax cracker. That's a processed food. It is very healthy. And so in the processed category, I think that's where it can be gray. Ultra processed, that's more clear cut. And so this is going to be the things where the way to visualize it is foods that were like whole foods, like an apple or wheat or something like that. Components of the food were taken out through industrial and scientific capabilities, basically. So you're extracting a piece of the whole food and then taking these individual pieces of whole foods that really weren't meant to exist in isolation together and re-putting them together into what I would call a frankenfood. So something that like never could exist. So it's not like it's cooked or it's squished or blended and mixed with other whole foods to make something new. It's when you've taken out individual constituent components of a whole food and then repackaged them together. So what you're going to see on labels, it's going to be the words and the chemicals that you can't pronounce. If they sound like they come from a factory and you don't know what they are, like I would just avoid it. But the three backbones of ultra-processed foods is refined white flour. The starchy part has been extracted and used to make this like bleached white flour. Refined added sugars, a sugar that has been extracted and hyper concentrated and crystallized. And then these industrial seed oils like the corn oil and canola oil and vegetable oils, where a seed has gone through like a 8 to 10 stage industrial extraction process that's used chemical solvents like hexanes and dewaxing and bleaching and heating to create this oil. Those three foods, ultra-processed industrial oils, ultra-processed refined sugars, and ultra-processed refined grains, are the backbone of basically all the processed food in America. And then to make them taste good, we add natural flavorings, artificial flavorings, food colorings, preservatives, all sorts of additives. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about ultra-processed foods. So there are lots of processed foods that come in a package that I would say are actually fine for our cellular biology. So look for the cleanest organic ingredients on the package without words you can't pronounce.
I haven't tried this, but I would imagine it would work well. I could probably just take a picture of the ingredients, go to your AI app of choice and say, are there ultra-processed foods in this ingredient list?
Totally.
And you might get a pretty good answer.
That's a brilliant idea, actually. I bet you could go to ChatGPT, take a picture, upload it, and say, where does this fall in the NOVA classification spectrum? And if it's the NOVA classification that is ultra-processed foods, I would say avoid it. Yeah. Or ask if any of the ingredients are banned in Europe.
And what about things like sugar? Just like, I want to bake cookies, I want to put sugar in it. Is the sugar you buy at the store, is that, do we all need to find a replacement for that?
The sugar that you're finding in that bag is most likely the same type of sugar that you're finding in the fruit. Like it's like a glucose, sucrose, fructose molecules, things like that. So it's not like it's a different type of sugar. It has to do with how concentrated it is. And when it comes to sugar, our body knows how to handle sugar. Like our bodies use sugar as a fuel. So it's not like sugar is toxic in its own right. The issue is that twofold. One, we have bodies that are now broken essentially from all those lifestyle kind of pillars that I mentioned that have more trouble processing sugar because we become insulin resistant, our mitochondria aren't working properly. So anything we put in, it's going to have a harder time processing it. And then the second piece is we are totally overwhelming the human body with excess substrate of glucose through the vast majority of our calories coming from ultra-processed grains and ultra-processed sugars, both of which turn into sugar in the bloodstream. So we've broken the body's capacity to process it, and we're overloading it with 20 to 100 times more sugar than we've ever eaten in human history. Together, that's created sort of the perfect storm in the American body to become metabolically dysfunctional. But it's not that the sugar itself is the one problem. It's compounding a bigger issue, and the quantity is just astronomical. So like if you want to make cookies once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, it's like, go ahead. But think about these other factors. Think about your body and think about what else is going into your body. And then nothing that anyone, myself or any other person talking about nutrition is saying like needs to actually be controversial, because we live in a world where we have amazing access to lab testing, amazing access to direct to consumer labs, wearables, biosensors. We have incredible technology that can tell us about our body composition. So I say that because you can know actually for yourself, all of us can know whether our diet is working for us by tracking our symptoms and tracking our key biomarkers. Like you can know if you're metabolically functional, I can know if I'm metabolically functional. And I would say the highest level, avoid ultra-processed food, eat organic, real, ideally local food, which will have the most nutrients. That's the highest level of nutrition that I think we can all do. Within that, of course, there's different dietary philosophies, vegan, carnivore, keto, paleo, whatever. But there's no one right answer because of biochemical individuality. And we each have the power now to know whether our diet is working for us and making us metabolically functional. And so we actually are past the point where we should be fighting about this if we were focused on more of like an N of 1 mindset to our own nutrition. And so I think that's the direction that we're going in with health. And I think it's going to hopefully just like eliminate diet wars. But, so because anything I say about nutrition right now with you, there are going to be people who vehemently disagree. Like even the point about ultra processed foods, but like, for instance, in my book, based on going deep into the science, there were 5 kind of components that were always sticking out of really elements of food that can really help our cell biology work optimally. And that was components that include micronutrients and antioxidants, omega-3 fats, fiber, healthy proteins, and a probiotic source. And so if we simply like make a list of our favorite foods that have those characteristics, like for omega-3s, it might be like, okay, I like chia seeds, I like basil seeds, I like wild-caught salmon. For fiber, it might be like, I like beans, I like green lentils, I like avocados, which are very high fiber. And you make your list and you stock your kitchen with those things. And so you're always kind of eating in those 5 things in all of your meals. I think it will move most people towards a much more metabolically healthy body. But there are carnivores who would look at that list and say, no, fiber, we don't need fiber. We don't need any of that. But this is the thing. If people commit to an mostly unprocessed, whole foods, clean diet and are tracking their symptoms and their biomarkers every few months, they will know if their diet is working for them. So that's kind of an exciting moment that we're living in that didn't exist 5 years ago when we didn't have all this direct to consumer sort of access.
Yeah, the other exciting moment when we already talked about using these AI tools, it's pretty easy to say, hey, I want a recipe that includes something from these 5 categories. Make me 20 recipes and I'll pick 5. And like we have tools now that we didn't have a year ago to make this really easy. So I'm glad you mentioned a handful of tools that people can find. And I want to get into the biomarkers, but before I want to talk a little bit more about a few of these other pillars. How important is, what we drink, water, hydration, and all of that relative to what we eat?
Yeah, hydration is super important. And there's several actually researchers out there who believe that we could hydrate ourselves to improving the obesity epidemic. Because one of the reasons that we actually print more fat in our bodies is to hold on to metabolic water. So water gets incorporated into the generation of making fat cells and filling fat cells. And so the example of this is a camel. The reason a camel actually has humps on its back is because of dehydration in the desert. Those when you break down the fat in the humps, it actually releases metabolic water to hydrate the camel. So they've done experiments where they've put more water fountains in schools, and actually the obesity and overweight rates have decreased just by children drinking more water, because it's a signal to the body that we don't need to be storing fat for metabolic water. So yeah, hydration is key. It's actually like probably the simplest thing we could be doing to improving our metabolic health. In terms of other drinks like coffee or green tea, these are incredible functional foods where if you're drinking organic coffee or green tea, in the coffee, you're going to be getting incredible antioxidant molecules in the coffee, very high antioxidant food. And then in the tea, similarly, you're going to be getting allagitannins, which are like a very potent antioxidant molecule. So I just, like with all things with food, I think about like, what are the impacts of the molecules in this thing that can impact my cell biology positively? I think we definitely want to avoid drinks that are overloading our body with sugars and with added colorings, because drinks can be ultra processed foods too, of course, if they have these additives and these colorings. So just really avoiding anything that's a liquid sugar, like a juice or a soda, especially things with fructose.
What about artificial sweeteners?
So with non-nutritive sweeteners, which are basically sweeteners that don't have caloric value, there's artificial and then there's natural. I mean, simply put, avoid the artificial non-nutritive sweeteners and then use the natural, organic, non-nutritive sweeteners in reasonable quantities.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the tests you can do, because it sounds like we're all different. And if you're relatively metabolically healthy, which unfortunately is like 7% of us, right? If you are, or you can find a diet that keeps you there, maybe for you, some of these things aren't as impactful. Is that fair? Like someone could find out, you know what, for me, a little extra sugar isn't really causing a lot of problems, or maybe the opposite. It's really bad. Right. I need to avoid it.
Certainly. I mean, and this is where the testing can be so helpful. Like, I mean, I'm never going to assume that like someone eating 20 times more sugar than we ever have before in human history is going to be completely in the clear. But because it's like, it's a lot biologically to process. We should use the precautionary principle with some of it as well, and like use our common sense. But yeah, I would say, here's an example. You look at like type 2 diabetes programs out there, and there are programs that have diametrically opposed philosophies. There's something like Averta Health, which is like a ketogenic diet for diabetes reversal. And then you have another program called Mastering Diabetes from Dr. Cyrus Kambata, which is a high carb, low fat, all plant-based, very, very high fruit sugar diet for reversing type 2 diabetes. And both have thousands of testimonials of people who have done well and have gotten their hemoglobin A1C down. So, and I'm sure there's people within both groups who haven't responded well to it, right? And have maybe switched over to the other one or whatever, but like totally different macronutrient dietary philosophies, both having good outcomes. So that is where really getting our biomarkers checked and following what matters can make a big difference and just making us feel more comfortable about what we're committing to.
A lot of people listening have gone and gotten their standard blood results. Many people might have even gotten a much more aggressive panel of 100 biomarkers. Are there a few in the metabolic health world that are like, these are the core ones to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think of it as like small, medium, large. For everyone in the world, I think there's 5 or 6 biomarkers that we should be doing like every 3 or 4 months just to make sure we're like staying on track. And I choose those because they are the biomarkers that define metabolic syndrome on the clinical level. So like they let us know if we have metabolic syndrome as defined by our medical agencies today or not. So this would be fasting glucose, triglyceride level, HDL cholesterol, waist circumference, and blood pressure. So 3 are blood work, 2 are not blood work. And together, like metabolic syndrome is defined by having 3 or more of those. When we're talking about the data I mentioned about like 93% of American adults having at least some element of metabolic dysfunction, what they did is they said if someone has any of those out of range, they count as being suboptimal metabolically. So metabolic syndrome, 3 or more. The 93% stat I'm talking about is any one of those being
so
off.
Be someone with high blood pressure.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. So the ranges for those that we want that they lay out would be you want to have a triglyceride less than 150, fasting glucose less than 100, blood pressure less than 120/80. Sometimes you'll see 130/85. HDL cholesterol above 50 in women or above 40 in men, and a waist circumference less than 35 inches in women and 40 inches in men. So if you just meet all of those, you would be part of that like 7% of Americans who are optimally metabolically healthy. The odd thing, and not to open another can of worms, but even some of those values are pretty lenient. Like triglycerides under 150 is considered optimal. In my book, I argue that triglycerides less than 100 and ideally less than 70 are actually optimal. So if we were talking about optimally metabolically healthy people in our country, we're getting down to like the 1% to 2% level. So that's kind of the basics. If you want to add on more to that, which your doctor won't fight you on, they're covered by insurance, there's like another set I would add, which is 6 or 7, which would be, of course, a hemoglobin A1C. So looking for average blood sugar levels. I'd want to see an ApoB, which is going to tell us about all the atherogenic, like pro-heart disease causing cholesterol containing particles in the blood. I always want to see a fasting insulin. So that's a test that can be ordered at any lab, but some doctors are a little less or more reticent to ordering that. But that's amazing because it can tell us really like early signs of metabolic dysfunction. If our mitochondria are starting to struggle in our cells, what the body's going to do is compensate by increasing our insulin levels, trying to drive more sugar into the cells. And so that's why fasting insulin is valuable. I love to see liver function tests because our liver is sort of like our key metabolic organ. It does so much for regulating our blood sugar and our insulin sensitivity. And when the liver kind of goes south metabolically, a lot of other dominoes fall in the body. So we want to have really pristine liver function tests. That's AST and ALT. And then another liver function test is called GGT, which is not going to be standard ordered. So you should ask your doctor for it. But what's cool about that test is that it goes up in the setting of more oxidative stress. And so we don't have a lot of good lab tests to tell us exactly how mitochondrial function is or exactly how oxidative stress are, these kind of physiologic aspects of metabolic dysfunction. But GGT, it will go up in the setting of our body needing to make more antioxidant proteins. So it's kind of a marker of how stressed our cells are. So GGT, and then also uric acid is a great one. So those are kind of like the handful of, 10 to 12 tests that you can get probably all through your primary care doctor without too much of a fight, that if you get those every 6 months, and like if those are all in the optimal range, like I'd say you're doing pretty well metabolically for sure. The other cool thing about all of those tests is they can change drastically in 2 to 3 months with like simple lifestyle habits. So if they're out of range, it's fine. It's like commit to like a more unprocessed whole food eating style, focus on some of the other pillars that impact metabolic health, the sleep, the emotional health, the environmental toxin avoidance, all those things, physical activity. And if you recheck in 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and you are really committed to some changes in dietary and lifestyle strategies, you will likely see a big change in a lot of them. So that's awesome because they're modifiable. Above and beyond those, then we get into like the more precision testing, and that's like DEXA scan. So body composition analysis, really see how much metabolically dangerous fat do you have in your body, visceral fat, the fat around our organs, how much muscle mass do you have? We know that muscle is our metabolic armor. We want a lot of it. So what's our subcutaneous fat, our visceral fat, our muscle, our bone health? That is really important for helping us understand like what's going on inside our body. Because you could be quite lean and actually have a large percentage of metabolically damaging fat coating your organs. And you want to know that. You could also be quite lean and that could be a sign that there's metabolic dysfunction brewing, even though you look thin. And there's a lot of people out there that fit this category, what's called TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, which is basically the thin people walking around who actually have metabolic dysfunction, which makes up about 40% of lean people.
And by the way, those tests, you mentioned a lot of the biomarkers are pretty much covered. And if they're not, I know some insurances might not cover your ApoB, but it's like $20 or $30.
It's not that expensive. Yeah.
DEXA scan sounds intimidating to a lot of people.
$100.
Yeah, not that expensive.
And you can order it direct to consumer.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot. I went to a place called DEXAFit. They have locations all over the country. You can book it, go in. It's super fast.
It's super
interesting. So I just don't want to scare people away of thinking like these are really expensive.
None of what we've said so far is hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the only ones that you might have to argue with your doctor about are the fasting insulin, the uric acid, and the GGT. I give some scripts in my books of how to talk to your doctor, but basically like the gist that you want to do with your doctor, because they might not be familiar with that test, is just say, I'm reading a lot about metabolic health. I'm so concerned about preventing this. I would love to get these tests. I'm happy to pay for them out of pocket. And I want to discuss them with you. Like really bring the doctor along. I think it's when it becomes adversarial that like there will maybe be a shutdown, but just sharing that. There's of course also so many direct to consumer companies now that do all these tests and dozens more for a very like reasonable price, like in the $400 to $500 range. So things like Function Health, Inside Tracker, Levels.
InstaLab is one that I came across.
Cool.
I think Life Extension does some.
Next Health does it remotely. Yeah. So there's like booming access to this. And so I use Function. And for me, what that does is it gets me 110 biomarkers and then 6 months later, about 50 or 60 follow-up, and that's for $499. So that's to me worth it because I don't have to like go through the rigmarole of doing it through a doctor's office. DEXA scan, do it about once a year, $100. Then there's some more advanced, and of course, if anything's not looking good and you want to understand more about your health, that's when it's really valuable to work with a functional medicine doctor and to get some of the other testing like the hormones, like sex hormones, thyroid hormones, nutrient levels, vitamin D, magnesium, really understand a broader picture of like the inputs to metabolic health. So nutrient status and things like that. So those of course are also very valuable. What I would just say, the reason I don't mention those in the first category is because those first category are really like a snapshot of like, how is your metabolic health? And then there's a whole nother set of labs that if you're trying to really fine tune things, you can get those to see what's going on under the hood and hopefully work with a functional medicine doctor on all that sort of stuff. But
what does that mean? Because I imagine if I don't know what a functional medicine doctor is, someone else listening also doesn't.
Okay. Yeah. So a functional medicine doctor, we've got our traditional allopathic sort of conventional medical doctors. That's like the person you'd see through, you get your insurance card and they pair you up with a PCP and that person has gone through medical school, or they might be a advanced practice practitioner like an NP or a PA or something like that. And they've gone through traditional American Western medical training. And there's a lot of benefits to that. And that's great. There are other doctors who have done that path and then have sort of awoken to this idea that there's something lacking in the Western medical system, which is that we don't really talk in detail about the environmental factors that are impacting our cellular biology. It's like, you've got this lab result, here's a pill. And so there are doctors that have done additional training in like nutrition, environmental factors, environmental toxins, how that's all affecting our cellular biology and leading to some of these problems we're seeing in the country. And that heading is usually what someone would call a functional medicine doctor, because they're focusing on the function of our cells, not just the labels of the diagnoses and the pills. So they usually do additional training to kind of learn this broader perspective on health. And now there's like many thousands of them around the country. You can find them through people who are certified in functional medicine. You can find them through a website called ifm.org, provider directory.
And they're going to be covered by insurance?
Not always. Sometimes they are. But it's sometimes you do have to pay out of pocket, but a lot of them, you could pay through potentially your FSA or HSA or something like that. So the idea is that they're going to be focused on trying to get the root cause of why you're not feeling well. And there's some cool startups like Parsley Health, which is like a digital, affordable version of functional medicine. And then there's, of course, like higher touch boutique type practices in different cities. But that can be a really great avenue if you feel stuck with the progress you're making with your conventional doctor, and they can be a partner in that journey to help you think more broadly and interpret some of the more detailed lab testing and focus on precision nutrition. And I also just want to shout out, like, this is kind of what a lot of naturopathic doctors have been doing for years, and they kind of unfortunately get sometimes left out of this conversation. But a really great naturopathic doctor can often be doing something very similar to what functional medicine doctors are doing. So yeah, I've had wonderful experiences with NDs as well.
Okay. So one question, this is going to be a little personal, but I think it might be relevant. So I've regularly checked a lot of labs. And one of the things I noticed was after going on a statin for ApoB, cholesterol, all this, I was watching my hemoglobin A1C go up. And it still hasn't crossed into 5.7 pre-diabetic level, but it went from, I want to say 5.1 to 5.6. Mm-hmm. Are trends like that things that if they don't cross over the threshold still concerning things? The average PCP, and I know because I've tried this, was like, no, you're not at 5.7, you're fine. But as people are doing this once and then maybe 6 months later, if they see their triglycerides going up, but in levels, if they see any of these happening, are those concerning? Even for me, I'm like, well, this is trending the wrong direction. That's bad. But is that something someone should react to?
This is going back to that Taoist statement of like, we're a process, not an entity. Like, we are dynamic beings and all health is on a spectrum. And the way we should use these lab tests is we should not really be looking at them in isolation, like just looking at triglycerides or just looking at hemoglobin A1C. That's how we are taught to think in medical school. Each lab is sort of a different thing. And if it's high, we need to bring it down. If it's low, we need to bring it up. The way I would suggest we think about it is look at all of these tests together, like you're reading the tea leaves of health, and think about the physiology, and what is actually happening. So when we're talking about hemoglobin A1C, we're talking about a representation of average exposure of your blood vessels to sugar, the concentration of sugar in your bloodstream over the 3-month period. So 5.6 is a different exposure of your blood vessels than 5.1%. You can look online. There's a calculator that you can calculate what the average in milligrams per deciliter is for each hemoglobin A1C. We could look that up. But no matter what, whether it's 5.7 or 5.6, at 5.6, your body is exposed to more glucose per day than if it were at 5.1 all the time. So that's worth thinking about, because what does that mean? Well, what does blood sugar do when it's floating through the bloodstream? It sticks to things. That's called glycation. Glycation is essentially where sugar that's floating around can bind to a protein or can bind to a cell, a vessel lining wall. And the higher concentration, the more that's going to happen. So I would be thinking, I think these thresholds, they're not arbitrary, because they were put out because of essentially at certain categories, we know risk goes up quite a bit, but within normal ranges, quote unquote, normal ranges, for most lab results, we know that as you go up within the normal, quote unquote, normal range, risk usually is already going up significantly, which is why I focus so much on optimal ranges. Because when I went to write my book and look at the literature, I don't want to be on the upswing of the slope before I get into some critical threshold. I want to be on the lowest end of that bell curve. But unfortunately, the way we think about statistics and probabilities in our Western medical system and sort of the lack of focus on more of like an N of one optimization focus, we don't think that way. So all that is to say, I'd be looking at what's your A1C, what's your insulin, what's your glucose, what's your triglyceride doing? You know, what is your uric acid doing? I'd look at them all together and I'd say, is this person moving towards a problem or not? I wouldn't be looking at one at a time. And then I'd also be thinking about like, what's the physiology mean of that marker going up and how could we potentially bring it back down?
Yeah, I've been looking more at the trend than just the isolation because I don't know, I'm like, oh, this thing's only bad if it's over 100. Well, if we're trending there and we're at 97, that's probably something to intervene and not just wait until you're over the edge.
And people at a fasting glucose of 97 milligrams per deciliter, which is just 3 away from prediabetes. And those people will often be told they don't have a problem by their doctor. That person is at significantly higher risk of future risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, stroke, and several other conditions than if their fasting glucose were 72 or 73. Also in the normal range, but the low end of normal. And there's papers in the New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of American Medical Association, premier journals that show exactly what happens as you go up each 5 points within the normal range. So we really, I mean, we so need to modernize the way we think about diagnostic categories because from a population perspective, they may work. On an individual perspective, we're letting a lot of people fall through the cracks.
Yeah. And one other thing that I've experimented with through levels is continuous glucose monitors as almost a way to understand how your body reacts to certain foods. You didn't mention that at all in some of the diagnostics. How do you think that plays a role and how should the average person think about it playing a role in understanding their own metabolic situation?
Yeah, so this is an amazing technology. It's been around for over a decade, but only in the last couple of years has it become something that the average person who doesn't have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes yet can use to be more of like an optimization and awareness tool. And that's, you know, what Levels' goal was to really radically improve metabolic awareness in our country. So this is a device, it's one on the arm. It's a wearable, similar like an Oura Ring or an Apple Watch, but it actually has a probe that's going under the skin, just about 4 millimeters, and it's painless. And it's doing a lab test every 10 to 15 minutes in your actual like interstitial fluid of your arm, testing blood sugar and send that information to your smartphone. So it's like a movie of your blood sugar 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The reason I don't include it as a diagnostic test is because they're not meant to be like a diagnostic test. They're the way that I think it's best to use is for anyone curious about optimization or how their diet and lifestyle is working for their body and to make more refined decisions, you can put it on. And then everything you do during the day, like what you eat for breakfast, what you eat for lunch, whether you got a good night's sleep or not, whether you did a HIIT workout or a zone 2 workout or walking, you can see how all those choices are instantly impacting your blood sugar levels. And we want our blood sugar levels to really be in like a pretty like low and stable and healthy range throughout our lifetime. Of course, like I mentioned, in 50% of Americans right now, we are like in the clinical prediabetes or type 2 diabetes category. So for over half of American adults, our blood sugar levels are problematic, which is a sign of metabolic dysfunction. So how do we actually use this tool early in our lives to figure out how to like cobble together a daily plan of food and food pairing and exercise and sleep and stress management to keep our blood sugars in that healthier range? And then when we see an outlier, like our blood sugar goes up really high, we can immediately identify what was the trigger for that and then go on a journey of curiosity to figure out why that happened. Was it I was stressed? Was it the food that I ate was like an unbalanced meal where it was like too heavy on the sugars and carbohydrates and not enough protein and fiber and fat and things like that? Is it that I was actually just super sleep deprived last night and now my insulin sensitivity is a little lower and so I'm spiking higher? So it essentially closes the loop for the first time in nutrition between what we're eating and what's happening immediately. Whereas previously biomarkers have always been a long lagging indicator and it's very hard to pinpoint what exactly was the issue. So this actually closes that feedback loop down to seconds, minutes, which is very empowering for people on their nutrition journey.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I learned was the order of what you eat. Like you could eat the same two things, one A then B or B then A, and it has a different impact.
Yeah.
So I guess to go back to food, how important is it that we eat certain things first, or how fast we eat them? Forgetting what we're eating. If we're not going to change our diet, which we probably should, but if we're not, like, how can we at least alter how we eat the food?
Such a great question. So there's several ways that we can think about the how of eating to positively impact how our body metabolizes the food. The first is timing of eating. So there's been research that suggests that if we eat our more carbohydrate forward meals earlier in the day, when we tend to be more insulin sensitive, meaning our cells have an easier time taking blood sugar out of the bloodstream to use it for energy, we tend to have a lower glucose response and insulin response compared to if we ate that same carb-rich meal at the end of the day after dark, like right before bed. So you may be getting almost more bang for your buck of glucose impact if you had that earlier in the day. We tend to become a little bit more insulin resistant late at night after the sun goes down. So that's number one. The second is actually to eat more slowly. So there's been some data to suggest that if we take time to eat, that we tend to have lower glucose responses. And over time, slower eaters have been shown to have lower risk of metabolic dysfunction and type 2 diabetes down the road. That could be for a number of reasons. It could be that when we eat slower, we actually get full faster because we're giving our body satiety hormones time to catch up. So we end up just self-inducing satiety by eating slower and giving the body more time. It could be the way that we're secreting digestive enzymes, all sorts of things, but makes sense that eating slower may make you eat less and metabolize things differently. You're also not having necessarily the glucose from the food hitting the bloodstream all at once and having that big spike. And then a third one that I think is actually important to mention, because there is data on it, is that eating with a sense of gratitude and eating with people that you trust can actually help you have a better metabolic response to the meal. So what your mindset is when you sit down to eat, and really looking at your food, engaging with the sensory elements of the meal, feeling gratitude for it. And the reason for this is probably because it puts you in a more parasympathetic nervous system state. So the more rest and digest state, the relaxed state. And that is the side of the nervous system that is going to do a better job of helping you metabolize the food. If we're running around, we're stressed, and then we just sit down or don't sit down, we're just shoveling food in, our body may actually be in the fight or flight mode when we're eating, and that's going to negatively impact the way we metabolize the meal. The last thing I would mention is just how valuable it can be to take a walk after your meal. So once you're done eating, do some movement. And the key is to just activate some of the major muscle groups of your body, because as those muscles contract, they are desperate for energy and glucose. And so you're going to be able to take glucose out of the bloodstream to fuel the muscles. And that can actually lower your response to the meal and have a lower, peak glucose after the meal, and just use it. Use some of the glucose. So it's not having to be just processed and stored, as if you were just sitting. And people might ask well, why does it matter if we have a big glucose spike after a meal? Why is it important to kind of soak the glucose up into the muscles after a meal by taking a walk? And there's several reasons, but the one that I think is most relevant to probably everyone listening is that when we have a high blood sugar spike and then a big crash after that blood sugar spike, which is called postprandial hypoglycemia. So post-meal, postprandial, hypo, low blood sugar. That happens when we spike high. Our body releases tons of insulin to take all that glucose out of the bloodstream, and then we actually crash. We overcompensate from the big spike with a crash. That crash is when people often feel tired, when they feel anxious, when they feel jittery, and when they have cravings for carbohydrates. And so this is basically the post-meal crash that you hear about. And this is, I think, why a lot of people are feeling mid-morning after a very carby, American pastry breakfast, muffin, donut, bagel, pastry, toast. It's all white carbs, right, that we eat for breakfast in America. That 2 hours later, they're like, gosh, I could use a Frappuccino. I could use a muffin. I could hit the vending machine. I could just get a little hit. The reason for that is because your glucose has been crashed. And now your body is trying to bring it back up to baseline. So it drives you to actually seek out more sugar. So the goal is to get off that roller coaster, right? To keep things just more steady. And so doing some of those tactics can be helpful. That's like sort of the sitting down to the meal. You also mentioned sequencing. If we eat our meals with protein and fat and fiber in the beginning of the meal, so these elements of food that don't spike our glucose, don't spike our blood sugar, and which actually can really promote satiety and fullness. If we eat those earlier in the course of our meal before the pasta or the bread or the chips or whatever it is, it actually reduces our overall glucose response to the whole meal. So we want to like put something in our belly to start, fiber, protein, or fat, that kind of blunts the glucose impact later in the meal. So that's both sequencing and also sort of speaks to the pairing. We want to have balanced meals that aren't just like straight carbs going in and hitting the bloodstream really fast.
So I've done a whole episode on sleep. We haven't really talked about it, except you mentioned if maybe you're sleep deprived. Are there a quick few sleep hygiene things someone should think about purely from the metabolic perspective?
There's 3 key things about sleep that relate to metabolic health. It's that we want to get good quantity of sleep, good quality of sleep, and good consistency of sleep. All 3 of those factors independently are related to our metabolic health. So unfortunately, what I'm basically saying to people is like, it's not just about the 7 to 8 hours. You actually have to get good quality and consistency. But I think it's helpful to know that, because some people may not be feeling their best or doing great with their metabolic health. And they're like, but I get 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night. So we need to dial into some of the other factors too. So when I talk about sleep quantity, the sweet spot for metabolic health seems to be about 7 to 8 hours of good quality sleep per night. It's variable for different people. This is why wearables like Oura rings are great. I know for me, I've been wearing this for a long time. I've been wearing a CGM for a long time. I know for me that my best metabolic health is between when my time asleep is between 7 hours and 30 minutes and 8 hours. Like that's when my glucose will wake up good and kind of be stable throughout the day. So everyone should learn that for themselves. But my data suggests that I fit squarely within what the data suggests, which is 7 to 8 hours on average per night. For quality, this is about uninterrupted sleep. So we know that people who have more interruptions in their sleep have a much higher risk for metabolic disease. So this is like animals jumping on the beds. This is blinking lights on the, carbon monoxide monitor in the room, the TV on, anything that's a distraction or interruption in the room or light in the room can impair quality of sleep, and that impacts metabolic health. So there's even been data showing that people who have more light on in the room while they're sleeping have worse metabolic health. So we want to have a dark, ideally uninterrupted sleep environment. I know that's tough for parents and, all that, but we can do the best we can. And then for consistency, we're talking about basically going to bed at a regular time and getting up at a regular time. This one has a profound impact on metabolic health. And I think has always been the hardest for me, especially because I was a shift worker when I was a surgeon. And so I was going to bed all different times. But one of the best unlocks we can do, I think, for sleep is to try to set a bedtime that's within about an hour, hour and a half at night, and a wake time that's within an hour to an hour and a half window, and really stick to that. Unfortunately, the wearables actually tell us that data now, like how consistent is your sleep. So we do tend to get more deep sleep at the beginning of the night. So trying to get to bed earlier seems to be like a good strategy to get the most out of our sleep.
And I did an episode with Molly Eastman about, we just went really deep on sleep. So if someone wants to go deeper, I'll link to that. We talked about walking being important after a meal. I know that walking in just general and exercise is important for metabolic health. Are there any components of exercise that are more or less important, whether it's strength or high intensity training or just, cardio?
Yeah. I think about different types of physical activity as different signals to the body of basically what the mitochondria are supposed to do. So we know that fundamentally, we want the mitochondria to be working properly. And of course, the lens I look at things is through metabolic health. But each different type of activity has a different stimulus for the mitochondria. So we kind of want to do a suite of things to get the outcomes we want. So for metabolic health, I like to think about we want to have lots of mitochondria. So we want to basically 3D print more mitochondria. We want each of those mitochondria to be healthy and functioning properly. And then we want each well-functioning mitochondria that we have to be processing as much energy as possible. And exercise can help you do all three of those things. So the first one is print more. So that's mitochondrial biogenesis, make more mitochondria. And there's different foods that can promote mitochondrial biogenesis, but it's also something we can do through resistance training, literally 3D print more muscle cells, muscle hypertrophy, and actually put more mitochondria in them. And it does appear that like HIIT training can promote mitochondrial biogenesis, as well as like zone 2 training. So like a lower heart rate, longer period of endurance training. And then there's basically creating for each mitochondria that we have, how do we make it healthier? So this is recycling of mitochondria, which is called mitophagy. So we have mitochondrial biogenesis, and then we have mitophagy. So mitophagy can be stimulated also through some endurance training. And it's essentially like putting it through a cleanup mechanism that kind of like cleans out the gunk of the mitochondria. So we want to definitely make sure we're getting like our endurance work in there. And that's the primary one that's going to focus on mitophagy. As for taking each of those mitochondria and clearing as much glucose as possible, that's walking. That's just using the muscles to, at a low grade way, be using and processing energy. So it's funny because, you look at like the government's recommendations for the type of physical activity that we should be doing, which less than 25% of Americans meet, which is basically between 75 minutes and 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic cardio activity per week, and at least 3 days a week of working like all major muscle groups with resistance training. And so, and just to be as active as possible with walking. And basically that's like kind of a good strategy. We want to be building muscle, we want to be improving the health of our muscle and our mitochondria, and we want to be using it to clear through energetic substrates. So what that could look like for someone in a given week is trying to aim for at least 7,000 steps a day. That's the walking, and ideally 10,000 or more a day. And the reason I say those numbers is because large studies have shown that people who get at least 7,000 steps a day just absolutely slash their risk of obesity, diabetes, other associated metabolic diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, premature mortality. Once you get up to 10,000 steps, it's an even better improvement. Above 12,000 steps, there doesn't seem to be that much more of like a benefit. So I would just say you gotta hit 7,000 steps a day, and it's better to do 10,000 steps a day. Resistance training at least 2 to 3 times a week, heavy weights, consistent, every major muscle group, super key. And then finding something that's more endurance and aerobic training that you really enjoy. So whether that's like the swimming or the jogging or the biking or a class or a sport or something like that. If you can add on spurts of high intensity as well as part of your sort of endurance training, I think that's great too. That's going to be like another hit for the mitochondria. But some type of package like that, resistance training, walking, and then more endurance type stuff that you really enjoy, like that makes for a great week. And that's going to hit your mitochondria from every angle.
Awesome. Okay. So there's a category where I really think talked about it at all, which is all these kind of things in our environment that are not the food, they're not what we're doing, air pollution, different lotions. How important are all of these kind of non-food, non-exercise things that we either put on or in or around our bodies?
I think it's of monumental importance. And I really do think we're going to look back at this time in history and just be horrified with how much we ignored it before it was, reaching kind of really disastrous effects. So when we think about environmental toxins, we know that there's about 80,000 or more synthetic toxins that are produced by manufacturing and industrial processes that have entered our food, water, air, personal care products, and homes over the past 50, 75 years. And most of them are invisible. You can't smell them, you can't see them, but they are affecting our cellular biology. That there was a landmark paper that came out about 2 years ago about this concept of obesogens, which is essentially a new name for what these chemicals in our environment can do to our cells. Mechanistically, these chemicals are causing metabolic dysfunction and obesity through several different mechanisms, like impairing our microbiome, changing our epigenetic patterns, changing our gene expression, endocrine disruption. So we're now labeling a lot of these chemicals obesogens because we know they they actually causatively lead to metabolic dysfunction. There's many classes of these chemicals, and you'll hear words like forever chemicals, PFAS, phthalates, BPAs, dioxins, like all these different things. I like to categorize it by just thinking about like food, water, air, and like my home and like what I'm surrounded around at home. And then I just try and do my best to like within those categories, like keep it as clean as possible. So for water, there's tons of chemicals in our tap water now. We really do want to filter our water, ideally with like a high quality activated charcoal filter or reverse osmosis or something like that. For the food, the best way to keep the chemicals out of your food is to buy organic. Also not eating ultra processed foods, because one of the big ways that we get the chemicals into our body is because they are being put into the ultra processed food. So just simply by like shopping at the farmer's market and talking to the farmers, you can eliminate a huge amount of the toxins we're being exposed to today. So that's food, water, air. I mean, the key thing about air is that outdoor air is less polluted than indoor air, which is kind of counterintuitive. And that's for the most part. We spend as Americans 93.5% of our time indoors now, either in a car or in our homes. One of the best and cheapest and easiest ways you can get cleaner air is just spend more time outside. So I now have a standing desk in my backyard. Like you create a little makeshift way to do what you normally need to do inside, try and do it outside. If you're indoors, you can filter your air. There's good air filters now, like HEPA filters and Air Doctor and things like that. But I would say before even investing in all the filters, just try and spend more than the 93.5% of your time indoors. Try and make that, lower it to 60%, right? Like just keep lowering it. And the last one I'll mention is just personal care products and home products. So there are so many chemicals that are coming into our homes via our products we put on our bodies and the products we clean our homes with. So it's really simple. It's just like buy the most like non-toxic, unscented, no coloring, cleaning and personal care products you can. Once you switch over, like I think you'll never go back because you'll immediately start feeling better. Just swap out each product for something that's simpler. If you're using the Ajax, maybe try baking soda. There's like thousands of blog posts online that talk about non-toxic home products, but it's not much more expensive and it just makes a huge difference. And then for the personal care products, it's like basically just going through everything you put on your body. The next one you buy, make it unscented, look at the ingredient list, make sure it's things you recognize. If it has chemicals that you can't pronounce or can't understand, don't buy it. There are so many non-toxic brands out there that are both good for the planet and good for the body. And like that will get thousands of chemicals out of your home. So that's kind of the landscape.
Okay. I feel like we hit on a lot of things. I want to leave with one question, which is someone who takes the time to improve a lot of these things, what do you think they're going to start to feel both immediately and in the long run?
Because metabolic health is the foundation of all health, what you can expect to feel if you really get on top of it is improved mood, mental clarity, so much more energy, better sleep, healthy weight. It's incredible what happens when you really fix this most foundational part of our biology. I would actually argue that if someone has any symptom that they are dealing with, mental or physical, any condition, any diagnosis, the best place that they can start to get on top of their health is to check out metabolic health because it is related to all aspects of health. This is a parallel path you should be pursuing in conjunction with the treatment of your symptom or your issue and make sure that it's dialed in because when we improve our metabolic health, pretty much everything in our body and in our life can get better.
What do you think the first place someone, finishes this episode and says, okay, what should I tackle first?
I would get the biomarkers. I would understand where you are on the spectrum of metabolic health. And that can be as simple as the 5 or 6 basic biomarkers to see where you stand. Get the triglycerides, the fasting glucose, the hemoglobin A1C, the HDL cholesterol, do a waist circumference, get a blood pressure. And if those are all in the normal and optimal range, that's fantastic. That means a lot of things are going right. And if they're not, it means that this is the start of the path and the journey towards getting them in the healthy range. Because if we are pursuing, reversal of our symptoms, reversal of a condition, if we're focused on longevity, if we want to improve our mental health and mood, underneath all of those things is good cellular function. And that is what we're really going for when we're working on improving metabolic health.
This is great. Where should someone go if they just want to go deeper?
There's so many resources. So certainly in my book, Good Energy, one really amazing resource for learning more about metabolic health is the Levels blog. So levelshealth.com/blog. It is the premier resource on the internet for summarizing the research on metabolic health and really practical things around like food and recipes and where to buy metabolically healthy food. So I would definitely recommend the Levels blog. And then my website, caseymeans.com. I have a newsletter that comes out every Tuesday. And we just talk about all sorts of aspects of metabolic health. So newsletter, book, and the Levels blog would be the three things I'd recommend. And my website is caseymeans.com.
They're all great resources. You undersold the book, #1 in the country. Everyone should check it out. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.